The hand was already closing around the wrist before it finished reaching. A big man's grip, aimed at a lapel, the kind of grab that's supposed to end a lesson before it starts, and it never got there. Bruce's fingers found the wrist first, turned it a half-inch off its line, and the whole attempt simply stopped existing, mid-motion, like a sentence cut off before the verb. No sound, but two pairs of feet resetting on a barewood floor and a curtain, heavy and dark, swaying very slightly at a window that had been sealed shut for months. For people, at most, ever claimed to have heard what went on in that room above the herbalist shop on the nights the curtains came down early. None of them ever agreed on what they heard. A scuffle, they said, or maybe just talking low and careful, the kind of talking men do when they don't want the walls repeating it. What they agreed on, the part that never changed no matter who told it, was the visitor. A big man, foreign, coming and going after dark for the better part of a winter, and Bruce himself pulling those curtains shut every single time before anyone so much as sat down. I can't prove any of that happened. Nobody who was actually in Oakland's Chinatown that winter can prove it either, and most of them are gone now, which is usually how these stories get their room to breathe. But here's the version that survived, the one a couple of old-timers still tell, low-voiced, like it's still worth being careful about, 60 years after it stopped mattering to anybody but the people telling it. Stay with me. This one takes its time to make sense, and I think that's the whole point of it. Here's the version they tell in the back rooms of old dojos, not about a fight this time, about a favor that should never have been asked, and a choice that never got to have a clean ending. One of those old-timers put it to me this way. Years ago, when I first went looking for this story instead of just hearing it secondhand, everybody in that neighborhood knew something was happening above that shop. Nobody agreed on what. That's not a mystery. That's just what a small neighborhood does with a locked door it isn't allowed to ask about. Take that for what it's worth. I think about it more than I probably should. Late 1965, sliding into a new year. Oakland's Chinatown was small enough that everybody's business belonged to everybody else eventually, whether they wanted it to or not. A few blocks of herbalists and grocers and family associations that had been arguing quietly among themselves since before the war, some of them still arguing about a young instructor with a storefront school 2 streets over who'd made the mistake, in certain eyes, of teaching gung fu to anybody who showed up ready to work. You already know a little about that fight. The one from a year before, the one that's still argued about at family dinners on both sides of the bay. What most versions of that story leave out is what came after. Not the 6 months Bruce spent alone in a back room, rebuilding his whole art from the joints up, though that's real too. What they leave out is smaller, meaner. The kind of detail that doesn't make it into a legend about a triumphant young fighter, because it isn't triumphant at all. The fight had won Bruce something. It just hadn't won him trust. Not from everybody. A handful of the older families across the 2 Chinatowns still watched him the way you watch a smart kid who got lucky once, waiting a little too patiently for the second mistake that would prove they'd been right about him all along. His school stayed open. His reputation stayed exactly as fragile as it had been the week before the fight, just louder about it. That's the room this story actually happens in. Not a storefront with a bell on the door. A shadow just off to the side of one. The space where a young man with something to protect has to decide, over and over, who he's willing to let walk through it. Wong's apothecary sat 2 doors down from a family association hall that had opinions about everyone, on a street narrow enough that you could hear a neighbor's radio through both walls if the night was quiet. Dried roots hung from the ceiling beams behind the counter. A single room sat above the shop, reached by an outside stair, rented out cheap to whoever needed somewhere private, and didn't ask too many questions about why. For most of that year, it sat mostly empty. Starting sometime around November, it didn't. Here's how the legend says it started, and I'll be honest with you before we get one sentence further into it. This part of the story has always struck me as a little too well-shaped to have happened exactly this way. A note, folded twice, passed to Bruce through a longshoreman he'd taught for free 2 summers running, back when the school was just a handful of students and an idea. The kind of favor you do for a man who once did you one. No questions, no explanation attached beyond what he was willing to give. The longshoreman worked the docks where the cargo ships came through. Merchant vessels, foreign crews rotating in and out on runs that had more to do with grain contracts and shipping schedules than anything either government wanted advertised too loudly. Among the men who came ashore on one particular ship's regular stop that year was an officer, not a diplomat, not what anyone in this story ever calls a spy outright, though that word gets used plenty in the versions told loosest, a broad-shouldered man in a gray overcoat that had clearly been chosen for how little attention it drew, not how well it fit. What the note said, according to every version I've ever heard, was short. A man wants to learn. He's serious. He can't be seen doing it. That's the whole letter, more or less 3 facts and a favor, delivered by a man Bruce trusted enough not to ask a 4th question. The longshoreman himself never explained, in any version of this that survived, exactly how he'd come to know a foreign officer well enough to carry a request like that on his behalf in the first place. Whether it was a debt owed from some earlier favor on the docks, a shared drink after a long shift, or something smaller and stranger than either. That gap in the story bothers me more than almost any other, if I'm honest with you. A whole legend balanced on a friendship nobody ever bothered to explain, passed between 2 men who both, for their own reasons, needed a favor delivered quietly and a door that would open without too many questions attached to it. Now, a Soviet officer ashore for a few weeks at a time, wanting private lessons from a 25-year-old kung fu instructor in Oakland, badly enough to risk being seen doing it? Almost certainly not exactly like this. That detail is too clean, too made for telling. And I think the reason it survived 60 years of retelling has less to do with whether it happened and more to do with what it lets people imagine happening in a locked room above a herb shop in the middle of the Cold War. Hold on to that thought. We'll come back to it because it matters more than whatever actually went on behind those curtains. For now, though, here's the legend, exactly as it's been passed down to me. Take it or leave it. The first night, by every account, nobody talked at all for the first 10 minutes. Bruce arrived a little after dark, let himself in through the side door the herbalist kept unlocked for him, and climbed the outside stair to a room that held a single chair, a mirror leaned against one wall, and nothing else. The overcoat was already there before he was, folded over the chair, not worn. Like the man inside, it had decided that much civility mattered even if nothing else about the arrangement did. He was younger than the coat made him look. That's the one physical detail every telling of this story keeps, oddly, more than any other, a man who dressed 20 years older than his face. The way people do when the job asks them to disappear into a room without anyone remembering exactly what they looked like leaving it. Broad, through the shoulders, careful with his hands, the kind of stillness that isn't calm, so much as trained. He didn't bow. He also didn't extend a hand. What he did, according to the one telling I trust the most because it's the least flattering to either man, was ask, in English good enough to have been practiced specifically for this room, whether the instructor charged by the session or by the month. Bruce told him neither, told him to close the curtain himself if it mattered that much to him, and see how the first hour went before anybody worried about money. That's not a diplomatic answer. That's not even a particularly warm one. But it's the answer of a man who'd spent the last several months of his life locked in a room by himself, arguing with his own reflection about how much of what he'd learned was worth keeping. And here was somebody willing to argue back, in person, without an ounce of reverence for who Bruce was supposed to be. Here's what gets me about that first session, the detail I keep returning to Bruce didn't ask him a single question about who he was or why he needed the curtain drawn. Not that night. Not for weeks after. Whatever this was, he decided to treat it as exactly what it looked like on the surface. A serious student showing up ready to work, and let everything underneath that stay the visitor's business, not his. Maybe that's naive. Maybe it's the only kind of decency this whole story has room for. I go back and forth on it more than I go back and forth on almost anything else in this legend, and I'll tell you honestly, I still haven't landed anywhere final. The curtain came down at 8. It stayed down until well past 10. Whatever the two of them did in that hour and a half, nobody outside that room ever claimed to have seen a single second of it directly. What they claimed to have heard, through a wall and a floor that weren't built for privacy at all, was the same rhythm the herbalist's own late customers sometimes caught drifting down through his ceiling for months after. Footwork, mostly. Occasionally something heavier landing on old wood. Never voices raised. Not once, in the whole run of it, did anyone downstairs ever report hearing either man sound angry. Weeks turned into months the way they do in every version of this story, quietly, without a single dramatic beat to mark the turning. Just an arrangement that kept not falling apart. Tuesdays, mostly, and the occasional Thursday when the ship's schedule allowed for it. The curtain came down before either man arrived and stayed down until well after the last one left. Nobody outside that room learned the officer's name. If he had one worth using in a story that half believes he invented it for the occasion, though one telling. The least reliable one, and I'll be honest that I doubt this detail more than any other in the whole legend, has Bruce's students calling him Nikolai behind his back, half as a joke, half because a story needs somebody to call something. I want to slow down here because this is the part that actually matters, more than the secrecy, more than the code, more than whether any of this happened exactly the way it's been handed down. What grew in that room, according to every version that survived, wasn't a spy story. It was a teacher discovering, session by session, that the man across from him took correction better than almost anyone else who'd ever walked through either of Bruce's doors. He didn't flinch for being wrong. That's rare. Most students, corrected on the same mistake 3 times running, start performing frustration whether they feel it or not. A little theater for the teacher's benefit, proof they're taking it seriously. This man just adjusted, quietly, the 4th time exactly the way he'd adjusted the first, like his ego simply wasn't in the room to begin with. Bruce noticed. Bruce, by every account that survived him on this specific point, respected almost nothing in a student more than that. He didn't raise his hands to correct in the way he might have with a beginner. That wasn't gentleness. That was arithmetic. A man this disciplined didn't need force to understand a lesson, only precision, and force costs more than it's worth against somebody who's already listening. The philosophy came out sideways, the way it always did with Bruce, never as a lecture, always as a comment dropped mid-motion and left there for the other man to pick up or not. Absorb what's useful. Discard the rest. Add what's specifically your own. He said some version of that to a dozen students that winter, and none of them heard it the way this one particular student seemed to, like a man taking notes for something bigger than an evening's exercise, something Bruce never asked about and the legend never fully explains. There's one specific night the legend keeps coming back to more than any other in that whole winter, because it's the night the arrangement stopped being just an arrangement. The officer had size on his side and knew it, and for weeks he'd been using it exactly the way a strong man learns to use it without ever being taught. Meeting force with more force, trusting the extra mass to win the argument eventually, the way it probably had every other argument his body had ever been part of. That night, he tried it once too often. Drove forward into a grip Bruce had shown him twice already, weight behind it, expecting the same result his weight had always bought him. Bruce didn't meet it. He turned it, a small rotation of the hip, almost nothing to look at, and the big man's own momentum carried him past where he meant to stop, off balance, one hand catching the wall to keep from going all the way down. He stood back up slowly, didn't look angry, looked, by the one account of this that survived, like a man doing arithmetic he didn't enjoy the answer to. Strength was never the lesson. Bruce is supposed to have told him, not unkindly, while the other man caught his breath against the wall. You have plenty of it. That was never in question. The question is what you do with it when it stops being enough, and tonight it stopped being enough. Maybe that's the exact line. Maybe it's been sharpened by 60 years of people wanting a better one. I don't know, and I've stopped pretending that not knowing bothers me the way it used to. What I do believe is the shape of the moment. A man used to winning through mass alone, discovering in a rented room above a herb shop that mass has a ceiling, taught that lesson by someone built at 2/3 his size who never once needed to raise his voice to prove it. He came back the following Tuesday anyway. That's the detail that actually matters here, more than the technique or the quote. A man could have taken that kind of correction as an insult and never climbed that stair again. He took it instead as exactly what it was, the first honest lesson anybody had given him in longer than he probably wanted to admit, and showed up ready to be wrong again. Chinatown is small. I mentioned that already, and it's the whole reason this next part of the story exists at all. A neighborhood that size doesn't keep secrets so much as it postpones them, and by February, this is where every version of the story starts agreeing with itself again. Oddly, after all the disagreement about names and dates, people had started noticing. Not the officer specifically. Nobody downstairs ever got a clean look at his face by every account. Not even the herbalist, who rented the room and still swore, years later, that he couldn't have picked the man out of a lineup of two. What they noticed was smaller and, in its way, worse a shape. A big man in a gray coat, arriving after dark on a schedule that didn't match anybody's normal business, disappearing up an outside stair that only ever led to one door. A curtain drawn early on specific nights, in a neighborhood where every window mattered to somebody. Add the reputation Bruce was already carrying that year. A young instructor, still only a season removed from the fight, that half the community still hadn't forgiven him for winning the wrong way, in the wrong room, against the wrong kind of opponent. And you don't need much imagination to guess what a shape like that, appearing regularly enough to notice, started to look like from the sidewalk. A gambling debt, some guessed. A woman he couldn't be seen with, guessed others, less kindly. Nobody, in those first weeks of noticing, guessed anywhere near the actual truth, because the actual truth was stranger than anything Chinatown's rumor mill usually bothered inventing. That's the part of this legend I trust the least and believe the most, both at once, and I don't think that's a contradiction. I think that's just what a good story does to you if you sit with it long enough. Now factor in what year this actually was, because the year is doing more work in this story than the code, or the curtain ever could. 1966. 3 years after a missile crisis that had every port city on the West Coast half convinced the next ship in the harbor might be the one that mattered. FBI field offices up and down California kept files. Thin ones, mostly, but real, on foreign crewmen who came ashore too often, stayed too late, wandered too far from the docks they were supposed to stay near. Immigration men made rounds through neighborhoods exactly like this one, not always looking for anything specific, just looking the way men do when looking is the whole job. None of that had anything to do directly with a gung fu lesson in a rented room above an apothecary. That was precisely the problem. It didn't need to have anything to do with it. A rumor that reached the wrong desk didn't require truth to do damage. It only required somebody deciding it was worth a second look, and a second look was exactly the kind of attention neither man in that room could survive. Here's what the stakes actually were, laid out plainly, because the legend usually rushes past this part to get to the drama, and I don't think that's fair to either man. If the officer was seen and reported, at minimum, his ship stopped calling at that port. Quietly, the way these things get handled without anyone above a certain rank ever having to explain why. At worst, and this is the version nobody in the story likes saying out loud, a man in his position, caught keeping company nobody authorized, faced consequences back home that had nothing to do with American law and everything to do with a different kind of file kept by a different kind of office, the kind that didn't hand out warnings. And Bruce's side of it was its own kind of exposure, quieter but no less real. A school still standing on the goodwill of a community that had barely forgiven him once already, discovered to be sheltering. However innocently, however far from politics the lessons themselves actually stayed, a man in a Soviet uniform shadow on American soil in the middle of the coldest stretch of a war that never once needed to fire a shot to ruin somebody. It wouldn't have mattered that nothing political was ever discussed in that room. It never does. A rumor that specific writes its own ending long before anybody bothers checking the facts. And the ending it writes doesn't ask permission from either man's actual intentions. There's a version of this legend, and I think it's worth saying plainly because it's the version that respects both men the most, where nobody involved was doing anything you'd call treason or espionage, or even particularly interesting by Cold War standards. Two serious men, meeting in a rented room, trading footwork for whatever this officer had to offer in exchange, which the legend never quite specifies, and I've stopped pretending I know. The danger here was never about what actually happened behind that curtain. The danger was entirely about what it would look like if anybody with the wrong kind of authority ever got close enough to guess. Look at it from the officer's side of it for a second, because almost every version of this legend forgets he had a side at all. A man stationed on a ship that spent more time between ports than in them. Ashore in a country his own government spent most of its energy telling him to distrust, in a decade when the wrong friendship, reported by the wrong crewman, could end a career before he ever got old enough to know if he'd wanted a different one. Whatever pulled him up that outside stair the first time? Curiosity about a discipline his own training had never touched, a private itch to be good at something nobody back home had taught him, or something lonelier than either of those, a few hours a week where nobody needed him to represent anything larger than himself. The legend has never settled on a single answer, and I don't think it's supposed to. One student, years later, described catching a glimpse of him just once through a gap in a doorway he wasn't supposed to be near. Not the coat, not the build, just the way he stood, shoulders down, weight even, listening to correction the way a man listens when he's decided, somewhere along the way. That being wrong in this one specific room was the safest kind of wrong available to him anywhere in his life. Take that for what it's worth. I find it more convincing than anything else this legend has to say about who he actually was. Whatever he was risking to be in that room, and by every version of this story, it was considerably more than Bruce was risking career, and possibly worse against reputation and a rumor. He kept showing up. That's worth sitting with for a second before the story moves on. Two men from opposite ends of a war neither one of them started, agreeing without ever quite saying, so that whatever this cost each of them, it was worth paying. Look at it from the herbalist side of it for a second, because I think his version of this story gets skipped more than anyone's. He never asked, by his own later account, what the room above his shop was being used for on the nights it went quiet early. He'd rented it for cash, no questions attached, the way small businesses in that neighborhood survived a decade that wasn't kind to them. And every month that arrangement continued was a month he was technically exposed to exactly the same risk as the two men upstairs without ever once being told what that risk actually was. He knew Bruce, trusted him, the way a neighborhood trusts somebody who's never once given a reason not to on the small stuff, even while still arguing about him on the big stuff. That trust bought a lot of silence. It didn't buy blindness. by his own telling, decades later, to whichever grandchild finally got him talking about it. He'd guessed, not the specifics, not the uniform, not the ship, but enough. Enough to know it was foreign. Enough to know it was serious. Enough to know that if it ever went wrong, it wasn't going to go wrong quietly, and it wasn't going to go wrong just for the two men upstairs. He never once asked Bruce to stop. That's the detail I keep coming back to out of everything in this whole legend. A man with every reason to protect his own small shop from a danger he could half see coming, choosing instead to keep renting the room, keep saying nothing, keep letting the curtain come down early on Tuesdays, because the one thing he trusted more than his own caution was a 25-year-old instructor's judgment about who deserved a locked door. That's not nothing. In a story about one man's dilemma, it's easy to forget how many other people were quietly making the same choice over and over just by staying silent. The herbalist wasn't the only one who guessed something. He was just the only one who never said anything about it out loud. James Lee, a real name, this one a real training partner, one of the handful of people Bruce trusted enough that year to actually call a friend rather than a student. Notice the schedule first. Tuesdays Bruce couldn't make dinner. A stretch of evenings, 3 or 4 times a month, where he simply wasn't reachable, no explanation offered, none asked for at first, because that's what friendship generally extends before it starts demanding answers. It stopped being nothing to ask about somewhere around January, when James caught sight of the coat himself. Not the man wearing it, just the coat, disappearing up a stairwell 2 doors from shop he had no obvious reason to be anywhere near. He didn't confront Bruce that night. He waited almost 2 weeks, turning it over before he finally asked the question directly in the back room of the school after the last student had gone home. Who is he, and why does it need a locked door? Bruce didn't lie to him. That's consistent with everything else this legend says about how he handled every single person who got close enough to notice. He simply declined to answer past what he was willing to give, the same way he'd have expected the same courtesy in reverse. A student, serious, needs privacy for reasons that aren't mine to explain. That's all James got. And by his own account, decades later, it wasn't nearly enough to satisfy him. What he said next is the detail I think matters most in this whole exchange, more than the secrecy itself. He told Bruce, flatly, that whatever this was, it wasn't just Bruce's risk to take anymore. The school had his name on it too. By then, his reputation, his standing with the same community that hadn't fully forgiven either of them for the year before. If this went wrong, it wasn't going to just cost the man in the coat, or Bruce alone. It was going to cost everyone who'd put their name next to his. Bruce heard him out, didn't argue the point, because by every account, he privately agreed with most of it. What he said back, according to the one telling of this exchange I trust, because it doesn't try to make either man sound wiser than he actually was in the moment, was short. He knew what it cost. He was the one carrying it. And if James wanted out of that risk entirely, he understood, and it wouldn't change a single thing between them. James didn't ask again after that. He also, by every account, never told anyone else what little he knew, which is its own kind of answer if you think about it long enough. A friend who disagreed with the risk said so once, plainly, and then chose to carry his own small piece of the silence anyway, because the alternative was making Bruce carry all of it completely alone. 6 weeks. That's how long it took by the tightest version of this timeline for the near miss to actually arrive. And when it did, it didn't come from where anybody in this story expected it to. Not the FBI, not immigration, arrival. There'd been, since the fight the year before, a small handful of instructors across the bay who'd never stopped looking for a reason to see Bruce's school shut down, quietly or otherwise. Men who'd lost students to him, lost face by association, or simply never forgiven a 20-something upstart for winning an argument that was supposed to have ended differently. One of them According to the version I trust most because it names no names and claims no proof, had a cousin who worked near the docks. A cousin who'd mentioned, in passing, over dinner, a big four-man seen more than once ducking up a stairwell 2 doors from the apothecary. It reached the rival within days. It reached Bruce within a week, in the form of visit. Not a threat exactly, nothing so clumsy as that. Just a conversation held in the doorway of his own school, in which a man he'd beaten once made it clear, in the polite, circling way certain conversations get held in that specific kind of tension, that he knew something. Didn't say what. Didn't need to. The threat wasn't in the words. It was in the fact that the words existed at all, aimed precisely enough to leave no doubt about which door they were aimed at. He came alone, late afternoon, when the school was empty of students and Bruce was alone sweeping a floor. He swept himself most days out of habit more than necessity. By the one account that survived this exact conversation almost word for word, passed down, the storyteller admits freely, through at least 2 people who weren't actually in the room. The rival didn't raise his voice once. Didn't need to. Interesting company you're keeping lately is the line every version of this exchange keeps, more or less unchanged, however much the rest of the conversation shifts in the retelling. Not a question. Bruce is supposed to have kept sweeping through it, not even looking up, which by every telling unsettled the other man more than any reply could have. A neighborhood this size, the rival is supposed to have gone on. People notice a coat like that. Foreign. Comes and goes. Somebody's going to ask the wrong question about it eventually. Be a shame if it was somebody official. Bruce is supposed to have stopped sweeping at that point. Not fast, not dramatically, just long enough to look up and ask evenly whether that was a warning or an offer. The rival never answered directly, which the legend treats as its own kind of answer. He left a few minutes later, without naming a single fact he actually knew, without making a single demand Bruce could refuse or agree to. That was the whole point of the visit, and both men understood it perfectly. A card shown just long enough to prove it existed, then folded back into a coat pocket, kept in reserve for whenever it might be worth more than it was worth spending that afternoon. Here's the moment this whole dilemma had been building toward, and I want to be honest about how ordinary it looked from the outside. No raised voices, no confrontation dramatic enough to draw a crowd, just 2 men standing in a doorway, one of them holding a card he had no intention of naming outright, the other one doing arithmetic behind a completely still face. Bruce said nothing that day that gave anything away. That part of the legend, at least, every telling agrees on. But something shifted the moment that door closed behind the visitor, because for the first time since the note had reached him back in November, this stopped being a private arrangement between 2 men who trusted each other, and became a decision Bruce alone was going to have to make, with consequences that reached well past either of them. Now, I want to stop the story here for a second, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a legend like this one usually cheats. The easy version, the one that would have made this whole story simpler to tell, has Bruce facing some direct threat of exposure and choosing, heroically, without a flicker of doubt, to protect his mysterious student no matter the cost. I don't buy that version, and I don't think you should either. It's too clean. It skips the part where a 25-year-old with a fragile business, a still healing reputation, and, by this point, a wife and a baby son to think about, actually sat with the option of just letting it end. Quietly. No confrontation, no announcement, just a note back through the same longshoreman. The arrangement's over, effective immediately. No hard feelings, stay safe. That option existed. It was, by any reasonable measure, the smart one. I bring this up because I think it's the most honest thing I can tell you about this entire legend. The version where Bruce faces zero temptation to just walk away isn't the real one. The real one, the one that actually respects him as a person instead of statue, has him sitting with that easier option for longer than one night, weighing a stranger's safety against his own family's, and not liking a single answer he came up with. His wife noticed before anyone else did, which the legend treats as unremarkable, because wives in every version of every story like this one always seem to notice first. Not the specifics. She never claimed to know, in whatever fragments of this she ever discussed later, exactly what was pulling at him that particular week. Just the distraction. A man normally decisive, going quiet over dinner in a way that wasn't like him, answering questions a half beat too late, the way people do when part of their attention has stayed behind in a conversation nobody else in the room was allowed to hear about. She's supposed to have asked him once, directly, whether whatever was bothering him had anything to do with the school. He told her, according to the one version of this exchange that's ever been repeated outside the family, that it had to do with a decision he hadn't made yet, and that he'd tell her once he had. She didn't push past that. Whatever else this legend gets wrong, I think that detail is worth keeping. A marriage where not knowing everything immediately wasn't the same thing as not trusting each other at all. That's the weight this decision actually carried. Underneath all the Cold War texture and the rivals' veiled threat and the rumor drifting through Chinatown sidewalks. Not abstract principle. A specific man at a specific kitchen table, choosing between the safety of the people who depended on him directly and a debt of trust he'd made as somebody who couldn't repay it in any currency his family would ever see. There's no clean answer to that kind of arithmetic. I don't think Bruce found one either. I think he just eventually decided which discomfort he could live with and which one he couldn't. That's the myth doing its work, by the way, smoothing what was probably days of genuinely ugly, private uncertainty into a single clean turning point, because a story needs one and real decisions rarely give you one. I don't know exactly how long Bruce actually sat with it. Nobody does, but I trust the discomfort more than I trust the timeline, and I think you should too. What tipped it, according to the version passed down by the one student who claims to have overheard any of this directly, wasn't courage in the way we usually mean the word. It was a question Bruce is supposed to have asked himself out loud, alone, in the same back room, where he'd spent 6 months a year earlier rebuilding everything he thought he knew about fighting. What exactly was he protecting, if the answer was nothing more than his own comfort? He didn't end the arrangement. He changed it. The sessions moved after that visit away from the room above the apothecary entirely, to a location the legend has never agreed on twice, which tells you something about how carefully it was actually kept quiet the second time around. Fewer nights, longer gaps between them, and for the first time since November, Bruce himself walked the officer partway back toward the docks when the lesson ended, alone, through back streets he chose specifically because they weren't the ones anyone watching would expect. That's the choice this whole story has been circling since the first sentence. Not a fight one, not a clean act of defiance shouted from a doorway. A quiet decision to accept more personal risk himself, walking a foreign officer through his own neighborhood after dark, at an hour when being seen doing it would have cost him everything the rumor alone hadn't yet, rather than let a man who trusted him find out that trust had a price ceiling after all. He never told the herbalist about the move, never told the rival who'd come calling that he knew exactly what that visit had been. He absorbed the risk personally instead of spreading it around to the people who hadn't chosen it. The shopkeeper who'd rented the room in good faith, the students who trained under his name every week without knowing any of this was happening 2 floors above their heads. If there's a single sentence I'd want you to keep from this whole legend, it's that one. The cost of doing the harder thing landed almost entirely on the one person who'd actually agreed to pay it. The last night neither man knew. Going in was the last night. That's not a dramatic flourish. That's just how these things actually end most of the time in real life and apparently in this legend too. No goodbye scene. No final exchange of wisdom delivered like a closing line in a film. By every account, it was an ordinary session, shorter than most because the officer seemed distracted, checking his coat pocket twice for something he never took out, mentioning once, almost offhand, that the ship's schedule had changed, a longer route this time, further out, no return date confirmed yet. Bruce didn't press him on it. That's consistent, at least with everything else this legend says about how he handled this particular student from the very first night. Whatever the man carried into that room, besides his own 2 hands, stayed the man's business, right up until the last time the door closed behind him. They finished the session the way they'd finished dozens before it. No ceremony. A short exchange about footwork Bruce wanted him to keep working on, a nod instead of a handshake, because a handshake between these 2 men on American soil, in the middle of everything this whole legend has been building toward, would have meant something neither one of them wanted to name out loud. One detail survives this exact evening more consistently than any other, and I'll admit up front that I find it almost too perfect, the kind of closing image a good storyteller invents specifically because a true story rarely hands you one this clean. As he reached for the coat, the officer is supposed to have set something down on the single chair in the room. Small, metal, the legends never agreed twice on exactly what: a button, a coin, a cheap tie clip, depending on who's telling it. No explanation offered. No note attached. Just an object left behind on purpose in a room that had never once seen either man leave anything of himself in it before. Bruce is supposed to have picked it up after the door closed, turned it over once, and put it in his own pocket without a word to anyone about why. Whether that object still existed in any drawer anywhere by the time this legend started getting told out loud, nobody's ever claimed to know. I mention it anyway, because a story this careful about what it doesn't know rarely bothers inventing a detail this small, unless it means something, and I'd rather hand it to you and let you decide than pretend I've already decided for you. The coat went back on. The curtain came up, and a big man in gray walked down an outside stair for what turned out, though nobody in the room knew it yet, to be the last time. He never came back. Not the following Tuesday, not the Thursday after that, not once more through the rest of that winter or the spring that followed it. The ship's schedule, when the longshoreman finally checked on it weeks later out of nothing more than curiosity, showed a route that no longer called at that port at all. Reassigned, rerouted, folded into whatever larger machinery moves a Cold War merchant fleet from one ocean to another without explaining itself to the men who used to walk its decks. Whether that was the whole truth or a cover for something else entirely, nobody in this story ever found out. Not the herbalist. Not the longshoreman who delivered that first note back in November. Not Bruce, who, by every account that touches on this at all, never spoke of it again to anyone outside a very small circle, and even then, only in fragments, years apart, never once filling in the gaps he clearly preferred to leave alone. So, did the officer get reassigned honestly, the way sailors do, for reasons that had nothing to do with a gung fu lesson in Oakland? Did somebody, somewhere up a much longer chain than a rival martial artist with a grudge, finally take that rumor seriously enough to move a piece off the board quietly, before it became a problem worth a headline? I don't know. Genuinely. Not the storyteller's version of I don't know, where I'm building suspense. I mean it. Nobody left in this story to ask has an answer. And I'm not going to invent one, just to give you a tidier ending than the truth ever offered anybody involved. That's where this part of the legend has to stop, unfinished, the same way it stopped for every single person who's ever told it before me. The herbalist kept renting that room out for another 20 years, by every account, never once to anyone who needed the curtain drawn quite that early again. He mentioned the winter maybe twice in his whole life. Both times to family, both times trailing off before finishing whatever he'd started to say. James Lee outlived Bruce by decades, and by every account that reaches this specific detail, never once brought up that backroom conversation again, either. Not out of secrecy at that point. Most people involved agreed, but because some conversations just don't need repeating once the thing they were about no longer has an ending to reach. And the object left on that chair, the coin, or the button, or whichever version you want to believe, nobody who ever went looking through what Bruce left behind years later claims to have found it. Maybe it was never real to begin with. Maybe it went the way small things go, lost in a move, forgotten in a coat pocket, thrown out by someone who didn't know what it was. Or maybe it's still out there somewhere, in a box nobody's opened in the right order yet. I like that version best, for what it's worth, though I'll be the first to admit that's exactly the kind of thing a storyteller likes best precisely, because it can never be checked. So, how much of that actually happened? Honestly, I guess almost none of it, at least not in this exact shape. A note passed through a longshoreman, a curtain drawn on schedule, arrival's visit time just so. That's a storyteller's architecture, and I built some of it myself just now, the way every single person who's ever told you this legend has built their own piece of it. What I do believe, what I think is worth believing, even knowing how much of the scaffolding around it is invented, is smaller and a lot less cinematic than a Cold War thriller. A young teacher, still only a year removed from a fight that had already cost him more sleep than it earned him respect, facing a version of the same question over and over that winter. How much is it worth risking, quietly, for someone who has absolutely no way of ever paying you back for it, and who you might never see again either way? He never found out what happened to the man he taught that winter. Neither did anyone else in this story. I think that's exactly why it's still being told 60 years later in the back rooms of dojos that have long since forgotten most of the details that actually mattered, because a story with a clean ending gets repeated for the ending. A story without one gets repeated for the question it never lets you stop asking. Maybe that's really what this legend has always been about, underneath the coat and the curtain and the rival's veiled little visit. Not a Cold War at all. Just an old, ordinary question dressed up in a foreign uniform to make it feel bigger than it is. How much of yourself are you willing to spend on somebody who can never pay you back, and can you live with never knowing if it mattered? Every generation that's told this story has answered that question a little differently, which is probably the real reason it hasn't died out yet. The myth isn't really about a Soviet officer at all. It's a mirror pointed at whoever's telling it. And I've been looking at my own reflection in it for longer than I probably should admit, sitting here telling it to you. This is a legend, a story I tell, dramatized and largely imagined, inspired by the real Bruce Lee, not a record of him. Almost none of the specific details in it can be verified, and I'd be lying to you if I pretended otherwise. But the man underneath it, the one weighing a stranger's safety against his own family's future, alone in a back room, and choosing to carry the heavier end of that weight himself instead of handing it to somebody who never agreed to hold it. That part, I'd bet my life, is real. And whatever became of the man he taught that winter, wherever that ship actually took him, I hope, somewhere along the way, he found a way to tell somebody about the room above the apothecary. I like to think one of them did, eventually. This is just my telling of it. Some men become legends because of what they did. Bruce became one because of what he chose not to do, until the next legend. If this one got you, there are more legends where this came from. Subscribe, and I'll keep telling them.